everybody, Chris here, and in this video we're going to start talking about the color tab of Davinci Resolve. And although there's a lot to cover in the color tab, in this particular video we're going to be focused on color wheels, which you can select over here in this panel, curves for controlling luminosity, color saturation, and hue. And over on the right we have this panel out here called scopes, and what this represents is depending on the colors in your photo, which colors, basically red, green, blue, the three main video colors, which ones have the most influence. So is there a lot of red in the photo? Is there a lot of green in the photo? Or is there a lot of blue in the photo? You can kind of get that idea by looking at that. So we're going to start off with the color wheels over here. And all of these tools mostly are for controlling, obviously, the color in your video, making it look how you want it to look, even if the original footage didn't quite have the right lighting or the right look to it. So you're kind of improving it, kind of an advanced application of filters where you have total control over everything to your video clips. So anyway, moving on to color wheels, you have four different sections here: lift, gamma, gain, and offset. All of these control the colors in your video, though lift, gamma, and gain target different basically spots in your video. So lift has the most influence over the parts of your video that have black. So that would be dark colors, kind of like this person's pants over there. Whereas gamma targets grays, like this other person's pants. And gain tries to target the lightest colors. So the whites, where you can see light kind of reflecting off of people's skin, depending on where the lighting was. That's where the gain will have the most influence. And then offset, I believe, is kind of applying color to the image, but across the board, not really being selective about the darker parts or the lighter parts. So I can kind of demonstrate changing the color here by clicking in these wheels and dragging them towards one color. Obviously, whichever color you drag it towards, that's basically how the color is going to shift in the video. So changing it towards more of a purple violet is going to make this scene. So you can see that when I use the lift to do this, the person's pants color is what really changes the most, because that's where the black was in the scene. Now if I go over here to gain and I change the color kind of towards more violet, you can see that the pants stay almost the same color, but it's actually the light colors which change. And then the gamma are kind of your midtones, the grays. That's kind of everything in between, and obviously it applies a little bit to the darker colors, kind of getting towards that black, and a little bit towards the pretty light colors, but not the darkest of colors, where you see the almost pure black spots where there's no light and dark pants. Now, of course, with these wheels, you can combine them. So if you wanted to make, well, that's way overkill there, sorry. But if you wanted to make the pants kind of purple, and you also want to make the light colors kind of purple, but maybe you want to make the midtones kind of green, you can kind of play around with this and get it to where you want it to be. Now obviously putting the colors all that far out looks pretty bad, so you probably wouldn't want, all the way on one color there. Now obviously when you're changing the color of your actual video footage, you're going to want to be more subtle about that. But let's move on to offset, just kind of demoing it here. You can kind of see the color gets applied across the board, and in many cases maybe you just want the offset to change so that you can kind of make the scene uniformly look like it was a different color lighting than it was before. So obviously if you kind of drag it towards the blue, it's going to make it look kind of like this blue light, or maybe you're near a swimming pool or something like that. You could also kind of move it towards the left where you have yellows, and it kind of looks a little bit more like a sunset. But yeah, that's just really basic applications of color there. So let's move on to curves for now. There's a lot of different dots for these curves, and they control different things. On the far left one, you have this line curve, and you can add in different points to the curve by left clicking. So on these curves, you have different sections you can click on. I guess you can call them tabs. So on this second one, and we'll go back to the first one at the end, because that's probably the most complicated one, but hue versus hue. If you just want to change the color in your clip, and you're not pinning it against anything else, so basically wherever you move it, it's only changing the color. So in the second tab over here, hue versus hue, what you have being controlled is the color of your video clip. Now, when we only have one key point here, it's going to be changing the hue of all of the colors in your clip. So if I drag this up, because the line is shifting, or the hue rotate really, it's changing the color on every other color inside of the clip. So it doesn't matter if it's blue that we're shifting or orange that we're shifting, it's going to shift all of it. So that's the default there. Now, there's a good chance you don't want that. You might want, like, let's say the blue to become an orange, but you might want not the baby face to also become blue. So how we would get around that is that we can add in extra key points. And we do that by just left clicking on the line, which is going to add a second point we can control. So if I drag this down here, we can reset the hue for non-blues, back towards the original hue, add in more key points to get additional control. And if we want to basically have this be a flat line, we can just drag this all the way over to the right. And we can do the same thing on the left side. So you can kind of see where the curves are coming from. The more points you add, the more control you have over your curves, but also that means the more you're going to have to manually shift things around. So if we move this a little bit closer, or actually maybe a little bit further away, you can kind of just play around with it until you get it right. So obviously there's a little bit of a flaw here where the color of the shirt is being changed when we really don't want that. Obviously this is one of those trial and error things where you want to get the color right, but you'll need to play around with the curves a little bit in order to get it correct. So we actually, let's just say, want the color of the shirt to change. So we need to keep playing around with this curve and the different positions on everything until we get the color in the scene right. So probably somewhere around there we could set it at if we're satisfied with that kind of orange color, or yellowish orange that we changed the blue on the shirt to, and it doesn't really seem to be impacting too much else in the scene. So that's one way you can adjust the color in your clip. Now the next curve tab is hue versus saturation. So we're taking the colors and we're mapping them to different color saturations. And what we mean when we say saturation is how much color do we want to actually show up in the video. So if we were to decrease the saturation for one of the colors, like red's over here on the sides, and we dropped it all the way down to 0 saturation, it would look basically black and white. Now if we add to the saturation, it's going to make the colors very, very vivid. Possibly to the point where it's unpleasing for the eye. So somewhere in between there is most likely going to be where you'd want the saturation of your video to be. So I'm going to add in one key point here so that we can kind of control it. And once again, because we only have one point, it's going to be affecting all the colors simultaneously. So if we increase the saturation, you can see that colors get very, very vivid, kind of overblown almost. It makes things like the baby's face look really, really awful and unrealistic. But if we drop it all the way to 0 saturation or 0.10 saturation, there's almost no color whatsoever in the video. And if you actually have a saturation of 0, then literally it would be black and white. So we can bump this back up to normal. And let's say our base saturation, we wanted it to be maybe a little less than the original actually, just kind of going with whatever here. So we can add in more key points, just like with the hue versus hue curve, by left clicking and adjusting that. So maybe for certain colors, we want it to really not show. And what we can do here is actually we can single out one color. I know that's something I've seen before that people like to play around with. So in this case, the only thing that's going to have any saturation is going to be that kind of yellowy orange. And we'll make it really stand out, whereas everything else is made pretty much black and white. Okay, so do need to be careful here because baby's shirt was showing a little bit of that pink. Obviously, the closer and more precise you get with these key points, the sharper it's going to be with the color. So you can just kind of adjust that until you get it right. Now, if we were to play around with that further, then obviously we could get that shirt completely singled out. I'm just going to kind of leave it there, and we'll move on to the next tab for now. Okay, so next up, hue versus luminosity. So instead of changing the color from really vivid to black and white, luminosity is how visible it is, basically how much light is actually showing. So if we drop the luminosity to 0, it's going to make the entire screen black, pretty much. So the next tab is hue versus luminosity. When we're talking about luminosity, instead of shifting the color from black or white, we're more talking about how visible the colors are. Now, they'll still be emitting the same general color, like an orange or blue, but it'll be emitting a lot less light, kind of shifting it more towards black, but like a black-orange instead of just black and white. So if I shift the luminosity down here, you'll see that across the board, things become less and less visible. But because the luminosity here is being adjusted against the hue, what this is going to mean is that the areas that actually have the colors are what's going to be affected the most in this comparison. So if you just wanted to darken the image, you'd probably just add opacity to it and make it maybe 50% opacity where the background of black would kick in. But if you're trying to get control over certain colors, kind of darkening their light emission, this would kind of be where you do it. So let's add a couple more key points in here, and we can adjust the luminosity of specific colors. So maybe we want the baby's face to be really bright, but other things to kind of be darker. We can just kind of adjust that until we get it right. So in this case, because the luminosity of those original blue colors, now note that although we shifted the blue on this shirt over towards like an orange color, it's still being treated as blue as its input hue. So that's actually what we want to target down here. But yeah, that blue is kind of being filtered out by the luminosity, and the other colors in the image are kind of remaining the same. So hopefully you kind of get the idea there. In the fifth tab, we have luminosity versus saturation, and this is more about controlling areas of the image and making it either very vivid or very black and white. But the bar graph, instead of hue, we're talking about which luminosity values in the image we actually want to saturate. So you can kind of see over on the left here, we have kind of blacks, and over on the white, top right, top bottom corner, or bottom left, bottom right corner, sorry. But rather than adjusting the saturation for specific colors, we're adjusting it for different basically visibility or luminosity levels in the image. So on the left over here, you can see that it's basically pitch black. So if you wanted to adjust the darker areas of the clip to be more or less saturated, you could add a key point over here and drag it up and down. You can kind of see, like, look at this top left corner, and you'll see that when I do it over here, that's the area which gets the most affected by adjusting the saturation by moving up and down. Likewise, on the right side, if I have a key point over here, it'll be adjusting very bright areas like the baby's face. Or if I want it to be very saturated, I can drag this up to the top or down to the bottom to make it more black and white. And then on the sixth tab, we have saturation versus saturation. So this is going to be changing the saturation values of the video based on the areas which had a certain saturation input. So at the end here, this would be affecting the areas which were originally the most saturated, such as the baby's face. You can see on the left side of the face, not the right side where it was highly luminous, but on the middle section where it had a lot of color. We can also decrease the color here. Maybe we want to make the saturation a bit more uniform. So on the far left, that's going to be the areas which had the least saturation initially, and we could drag that up. So by having a downward sloping curve like that, we kind of even out the saturation levels in the video. So in the custom tab on the left, we have more control over the color in our clip. So one thing we can do with this tab up here at the top left is to kind of shift the color in the RGB color, red, green, blue, towards the center point by dragging this closer and closer to the center. So what actually happens here is that these color levels are kind of being compressed more and more towards a gray. So it still follows the same pattern. It still has the same shape, but it's being brought more and more in line with that 512 gray area, which is half between black, half between white. Alternatively, we can drag it below that middle point, and it's going to flip the colors upside down. If it's so close to the middle point, obviously it's going to be kind of compressed still. But if we drag it all the way to the bottom, it literally inverses the color in our video clip. So at the very bottom here, it's a full inverse color. It's not compacted at all towards that 512 middle point, and we get the full color. Another thing we can do is adjust one side of that color scope. So if we want to remove the highs and make it get closer and closer to 0 on all color, we can drag this down. So it's kind of the same as setting opacity, where you just kind of darken your video. Everything's being brought closer and closer to 0, and you can actually go all the way to the bottom. So another thing you can do, of course, the opposite, you can make it brighter and brighter, where you compress everything up towards that full color point. And if you go all the way, you would get white. Now, if you want more precise control over the color in your clip, you can start adding in some key points, and you can start adjusting only specific parts of your video clip. So if I drag over here where we're by the left-hand side, what it's going to be affecting are the light colors. So if we add a point over here on the left that's close to the dark side, dark on the left, bright on the right, and we start adjusting this, it's going to be increasing or decreasing the basically the color amount for those darker colors. So over here about 20%, and this is affecting kind of the dark grays, not the blacks in the video, but kind of those grays, which would be like the parts of the pants which have a little bit of color. But since we have a lot of points now, we can increase the brightness or the color on the absolute blacks, or we could tone down the light colors. Now, by default, this is affecting all colors simultaneously. Red, green, blue, that's how you make up all the colors in the photo, if you didn't know. But what we can do is actually unlink this if we only want to increase the prevalence of one of these colors in the video. So if I unlink that, and we go over here and click on red, now we're adjusting only the reds that are in the video clip. So if we want to add more red, let's say add more red to the darker areas, we can drag these points up. You'll notice, of course, because we had it linked before for the Y, R, G, and B values for all of them, those were all being moved simultaneously while it was linked. But now that it's unlinked, they're individualized. So if we wanted to, let's say, go over here to the green and remove some green from the highlight areas, or the really bright, colorful spots, we can drag this line down. And we can do the same thing with blue. So let's just say we wanted to make it a really, really blue photo. Obviously, you should be able to tell that getting the color right where it's actually going to look like what you want is going to take some experimenting here. So the last section that I want to show you guys in this video is the soft clip box over here. So what soft clip allows you to do is add basically a hard or soft limit to one or all of the colors in your video simultaneously. So by default, the colors are linked together. So RGB, basically all the color in your video, would be linked together for these limits. You can uncheck that if you want the limits to be set for each of these colors individually. So in order to actually set a limit here with soft clip, we would have to increase the low above 0. And you can see that happening there after we get to about 60, or we need to decrease the high below 100. So by doing that with the first two settings, low and high, we get these hard line limits set on the color for the clip. And you can see that kind of gets reflected over here. So in a way, it's actually a lot like we did this with the video. We're using the soft clip tool to do that instead. Now, the difference is that rather than kind of compressing everything towards the middle ground, this is simply cutting off the top and the bottom ends. So when we have these clip points set, and we don't want it to be a completely hard clip where it's just basically putting a line straight across, but to kind of smooth things out a bit, we can add in some high smoothing. So you'll be able to see that those high points, it kind of becomes a little bit more curvy rather than just the hard limits. And the higher we increase the high soft, the less of a hard line that's going to be. And likewise with the low soft, we can reduce the level of that clip point being a hard line. Now, of course, just like with the edit section up there, if you want it to only affect certain colors, we can go add the green back to 100 high, 0 low, completely reset everything back to defaults, and now the green is in the photo just like it was before, but the reds and the blues are still being affected by that clip. So there's a lot more tools that we can use in Davinci Resolve to affect how our video looks and the color tab, but it kind of goes beyond the bounds of just this one video. So I'm going to leave more until next time. So I've been Chris. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and I will see you guys in my future content.